Hi guys, welcome back to the Rugby Psychology Series. Let's talk about the quest for optimal arousal. Getting up for it, getting hyped, pumped, whatever you want to call it. Before a match, in the lead up to a match, coaches and players are desperate to get to that ultimate intensity level. Now in rugby, at the elite level, it's not normally so much of a problem because it's such a big event. For clubs or lower levels where you've got lots and lots of games, there's lots of other things going on in your life as well as amateur level. It's really, really hard. And half of a coach's job is to try and get their team to that right level of arousal. That's physical and mental readiness for the game. Now in rugby, the classic ways you do that are through music in the team room, maybe on the way there in the bus if it's an away game, team talks, classic squeezes, all that sort of stuff, trying to get those arousal levels high enough. Interestingly, in this year's Six Nations, we did see a few drop-offs, I thought, from Wales in two of their games. In my reports, I definitely commented that their arousal levels definitely seemed fairly low. In a couple of their other games, it was right on point and really high. So it is a tricky balance. It can go wrong, even at the top level. So let's look at some theories. First of all, this is drive theory. This is really, really simple. It says the more aroused you are, the better you perform. Now, of course, that's too simple, but there is some truth in that, especially if the task is very simple, it's very physical, and also if you've learnt it really well. Because, of course, arousal can block out thought processes, can narrow your attention. We'll talk about that later. But if the task is simple and you know what you're doing, you can get really highly aroused, really pumped for the task. For example, smashing tackles, hitting rucks, those sorts of things. You need that high arousal level. However, there's a bit more to it than that. You definitely can get over-aroused as well. And in rugby, it's that very difficult mix. You've got a lot of high-intense physical activity and then a lot of intricate skills as well and coordination. So it really is a tough mix to get where you have to raise and lower your arousal throughout the game, especially someone like a kicker or a line-out thrower. So can you get too hyped up? Well, inverted U theory is slightly better than drive theory, widely recognised so. It can be a bit more sport-specific. So here's a classic inverted U. I don't know why they don't just call it N theory. But anyway, you can see there's a peak there at the top, which is the optimal arousal level, where if you get to that, you're at your peak performance. But if you go over that, then you actually might start coming down the other side and start mucking up your performance by being too aroused. Now for rugby, this shift is probably quite a lot to the right. The N is quite a long way to the right because it's a highly physical task, but there will be other sports and activities that will be even further to the right because I said there is complexity in rugby as well. But compared to other sports, say golf will be a long way to the left. So anyway, you can move that curve around. Let me know how far, where the optimal is for you. Let me know your stories, your team talks, where you got to, you think, the peak level. Or maybe tell me a story where you got too hyped up and you did something silly. They're always worth saying as well. And when you get too aroused, you can have a bit of a catastrophic drop-off in performances sometimes. Not a lot, but it can happen. Catastrophe Theory explains this. It's all about going past that optimal arousal point and your anxiety sticking around. If you're still playing or you think back to when you played, your anxiety was fairly high towards the game, certainly up until kick-off. You were, maybe sweating, you went to the loo a lot. Neil Jenkins famously was sick before every game. But when the kick-off happens, when the game starts, that anxiety tends to drift away and it doesn't affect your performance. However, what if it sticks around? What if being more and more aroused just makes you more and more anxious? It affects your physical ability, your somatic ability, and you start making mistakes, and those mistakes compound each other, and they get worse and worse and worse. Like I said, it normally doesn't happen. Even Johnny Wilkinson, had massive anxiety before games, but once he got into the game, it didn't affect his performance. If you want to have a bit of fun where this catastrophe theory did happen, check out some of these clips on YouTube. We've got Luaki for New Zealand, and the anxiety just got far too much. He kept losing the ball in contact, really killed New Zealand in that game. Ugo Monye, they played him at fullback a few times, and he had one game where he has a real high ball shocker, and every ball goes down, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. And then the ultimate, of course, is Mauro Bergamasco, poor Bergamasco, the flanker, excellent flanker who gets put by Mallet at scrum half for Italy. He's not a great scrum half. His first pass goes wrong and it just gets worse and worse and worse. And that's compounded with arousal theory, because being a novice, you really need lower levels of arousal to actually execute the skills, because you've got to think about them. He was playing in a high-intense international game when he hadn't learnt the skill of scrum half pass. The anxiety got too much as well, and it just went catastrophically wrong. So have a look at those three. Also, maybe have a bit of sympathy for those guys involved, because it can happen to everyone. Now, in reality, your optimal performance probably isn't just a point at the peak of a graph. It probably is a zone. This idea of IZOF, an individual zone of optimal functioning, is probably a bit more accurate, to be honest, that you could be within a certain zone and perform very well. It's impossible to get exactly where you need to be every single time, but most top players perform, a 7 out of 10 most times. And I'd love to know where your individual optimal zone is. Do you tend to have slightly lower arousal, slightly higher arousal? How do you achieve that, be it with music or pre-match routine? I'd love to know. Now, a phrase we may have heard in rugby before is teacup, think clearly under pressure. And top players can do this, because when your arousal gets high, it's natural for your attention to narrow, attentional narrowing. And that's just going to happen. And that's fine as long as you can attend to the relevant cues and the narrowing filters out the irrelevant ones, like the crowd, or maybe it's that winger who always calls for the crossfield kick when it's not on. Filter out those things and you can still attend to the things that are important. But if you get that tunnel vision, then your performance can drop off. For example, you make a break, there's a 2-on-1, but you're too focused on where you're running to see it. You see that a lot, even at the top level. But those top players, they can focus on what's important, be it the 2-on-1, be it the decision that needs to be made. And when there's defenders in your face, that's very, very hard. With that high arousal level, can you focus on the right thing? So let me know if you're good at that, or if that's something you're working on, or some examples where you've done it well or not. It's always interesting when you tell us those stories. Now, the last idea I want to bring up is this idea of flow state. We tend to call it being in the zone, that perfect position of arousal where you're right on the money. And top performers tend to report this flow state when they're right at the peak of their powers. Sometimes it's maybe a World Cup final or a big game where they've performed really, really well, and the game seems to pass them in a dream. Everything is effortless. It's kind of an out-of-body experience. They can't even remember being there. Let me know if you've ever been in that zone, that flow state where everything is spot on, but everything's a bit fuzzy afterwards because you're so focused and everything is nice and natural. Let me know if you've got there. Not many people do. It's very impressive if you can, and even the top players don't get there all the time. So finally, pop in the comments below your tips and tricks for getting that optimal arousal, how you do it for your team, when it's worked, when it hasn't worked. And also tell us those stories where your team maybe has got it right and had a big upset against a team that's a bit complacent. For example, when Japan beat South Africa and South Africa weren't quite ready for them and Japan were right on it. Have you had any of those incidents, any of those stories of amazing victories because of arousal differences? Anyway, guys, pop all those comments below. I'd love to know your thoughts, and I'll catch you next time.